The cause of Martin Luther's death.
There is a Chinese saying, "The deceased is paramount," which signifies the utmost respect for the departed. This usually means that for the deceased, only their achievements are remembered, and their faults are not spoken of. However, there are exceptions to everything. For a controversial historical figure, even after their life has passed, their posthumous reputation may be repeatedly speculated upon. Martin Luther, a figure in the 16th century Reformation, was a pitiable man who was exploited. It's a shame that the Chinese often say, a pitiable person must have something detestable about them. In reality, Martin Luther continues to be exploited even today. And even the cause of his death has become a golden topic for later generations to relish and endlessly speculate upon. Some say he achieved eternal fame, while others say he left a notorious legacy.
The cause of Martin Luther's death.
Regarding the cause of Martin Luther's death, the mainstream view is natural death. According to contemporary historical records, Luther died naturally of illness in his hometown of Eisleben on February 18, 1546, at the age of 62. Prior to this, he had long suffered from various ailments, including heart disease, gallstones, arthritis, and digestive problems. Most importantly, he had long suffered from severe depression. Before his death, he was already very weak and had experienced multiple angina attacks. Specific details of death. 1. Stroke or heart failure. These are the most frequently mentioned causes of death, consistent with his health in his later years. Before his death, he had complained of chest pain and difficulty breathing. 2. Other complications. His multiple chronic diseases may have ultimately led to the failure of his bodily functions. Doctors and some friends were present at the time. Their testimonies all indicate that Luther died peacefully and naturally. Of course, these are all one-sided accounts. After Luther's death, various versions of his cause of death emerged. Among them, the most prominent was the accusation of self-murder. These self-murder theories were likely primarily intended to discredit Luther as a leader of the Reformation, portraying his death as a disgraceful end, thereby denying his role in the Reformation movement. However, these claims lack reliable eyewitness testimony or medical evidence and are likely based on hostility. Besides self-murder, there were also suggestions that Luther died due to excessive alcohol consumption, or from something terrible related to his heretical beliefs, such as being claimed by the devil. Luther was undoubtedly a star figure of the Reformation. He posed a huge challenge to the authority of the Catholic Church, so he made many enemies. After his death, many people continued to blacken his name. Spreading disgraceful causes of death was a common tactic. The official Catholic Church never issued a formal statement claiming Luther committed self-murder, although the Catholic Church regarded Luther as a heretic and issued a bull of excommunication in 1521. There is no evidence that the papacy and the empire were determined to hunt him down. Regarding the claims of Luther's alcohol-induced self-murder, some specific, sensational details did circulate historically. Their purpose was clearly to maximally slander Luther's image and make his death disgraceful.
Specific descriptions of the alcohol-induced self-murder theory.
These rumors typically depict Luther's death in several versions. 1. Hanging after drunken despair. This is the most common and widely circulated version. Descriptions usually state that Luther, in the night, fell into extreme despair, even madness, due to heavy drinking. Then, unbeknownst to anyone, he hanged himself in his room. Sometimes, details are added, such as his face being distorted and his tongue protruding at the time of death, aimed at creating terror and a sense of sin. 2. Sudden death after drunken collapse. Another theory suggests that Luther did not directly commit self-murder, but rather that his body collapsed due to chronic alcoholism, eventually leading to sudden death in a drunken state. While this description does not directly accuse self-murder, it also implies that his death was due to unrestrained behavior, similarly carrying a derogatory meaning. 3. Unnatural death and abnormal corpse changes. Some even more extreme versions describe abnormal changes in Luther's corpse after death, such as extremely rapid decomposition, foul odors, or his body being taken away by the devil. These were common methods of demonizing heretics in the Middle Ages, aiming to reinforce his deeply sinful image through supernatural and terrifying descriptions. These descriptions are often combined with the alcohol abuse claims, suggesting that heavy drinking was the cause of his downfall and ultimate tragic end. These alcohol-induced self-murder theories primarily originated from Luther's opponents, especially the radical wing of the Catholic Church. After Luther's death, they tried to seize every opportunity to invalidate his Reformation movement. Their core purpose was to deny his religious claims by attacking Luther's personal character. They aimed to portray Luther's death as divine retribution, or the devil's revenge, to intimidate his followers and weaken his influence among ordinary people by spreading these negative stories.
Doubts regarding the stance of historical sources.
Doubts regarding the stance of historical sources is a very insightful point. The key is that even the first-hand accounts of people close to Luther may be biased due to their standpoint, thereby affecting the credibility of their statements. Emperor Taizong of Tangli Shimin personally revised historical records. Therefore, fabricating and modifying history becomes an unavoidable situation. Thus, credibility becomes a matter of individual judgment. In historical research, there is indeed a problem known as historical bias. Any historical record can be influenced by the recorder's standpoint, purpose, emotions, and other factors. When dealing with highly controversial historical figures like Luther, it is difficult for both supporters and opponents to maintain absolute neutrality in their accounts. Luther's followers, colleagues, and friends, all from the Protestant faction, naturally wished to protect his reputation and emphasize the steadfastness of his faith and the nobility of his character. They would deliberately record his peaceful, devout death, like a cinematic script, to confirm his divine mission and the grace he received. On the other hand, the Catholic Church and its supporters would spare no effort to blacken his name, spreading rumors that he died due to sin and despair, thereby denying the legitimacy of the Reformation. Therefore, considering that everyone around Luther belonged to the same faction, it is absolutely correct to question the authenticity. However, the reason why the historical community generally accepts the natural death theory is that this conclusion is based on cross-verification, motivational analysis, and logical judgment of multiple historical sources. Although the records of those close to him may contain embellishments, more importantly, the claims attempting to blacken his name are weaker in terms of evidence. In fact, despite the doubts, academia has no other choice. Of course, the natural death theory also eliminates the suspicion that Luther was assassinated by the Papal See and the Empire.
Why was Luther not pursued after excommunication?
The Catholic Church, after excommunicating Luther, did not treat him like his predecessor, Jan Hus, who was arrested and burned at the stake. This is indeed a noteworthy historical fact, and behind it, there must have been complex political reasons. There were several religious reformers before Luther, and Jan Hus was one of them. He was a priest, philosopher, and rector of Charles University in Prague, Bohemia, present-day Czech Republic. He was ultimately condemned to be burned at the stake by the papacy. Luther's era differed from Jan Hus's time. The Holy Roman Empire was increasingly showing tendencies towards fragmentation, and many German prince-electors and nobles saw political opportunities in the Reformation. They hoped to use it to weaken the power of the emperor and the pope and to seize church property. Therefore, Luther was exploited by powerful princes, such as Frederick III, Elector of Saxony. The political support of these princes made it difficult for the papacy and the empire to easily arrest or execute Luther. Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, though a devout Catholic, needed the support of the German princes to counter the Ottoman Empire and France. Thus, taking overly harsh action against Luther might have sparked a full-scale rebellion among the German princes, leading the empire into civil war, which he did not wish to see. Furthermore, the proliferation of the printing press allowed Luther's ideas to spread rapidly, far exceeding any previous heretical movement. Therefore, even if Luther himself were executed, his ideas had already spread widely and would be difficult to eradicate completely. Consequently, although the Catholic Church excommunicated Luther, in practice, facing a complex political environment, they found it truly difficult to physically eliminate him directly. In fact, the Catholic Church didn't need to make a big deal out of the cause of Luther's death. From a modern perspective, if one cannot pursue and kill the person, then fabricating rumors about their cause of death after they die seems somewhat redundant and counterproductive. However, in that era of intense religious conflict, posthumous slandering of an enemy leader was also a very common method of struggle. Luther's death was not merely the passing of an individual, but a symbolic event for the Reformation movement. If it could be proven that he died for disgraceful reasons, this could be used to belittle the entire Reform movement he represented, implying that the Reform itself was evil and not pleasing to God. For Catholics, spreading rumors of Luther's self-murder helped reinforce their faith in Catholicism and warned them to stay away from heresy. By discrediting Luther's image, the morale of the Reformers could be struck, and those who were undecided could be dissuaded. The recording of history is a power struggle. Whoever can define the nature of events gains the upper hand in the perceptions of later generations. Therefore, the Catholic Church tried to take the initiative in the narrative of Luther's death, using negative descriptions to shape his historical image. So, even if direct physical elimination was not possible, making a big deal on a spiritual level still held immense value. This was a continuous ideological war.
Traveling far and wide to meddle in others' affairs.
As the saying goes, there's no place like home, but out there, everything is difficult. Luther traveled far and wide, enduring days of arduous journey, to return to his hometown of Eisleben to meddle in someone else's trivial matter. This suggests that his physical condition was still decent. In reality, in his later years, Luther suffered from various diseases, including severe kidney stones, angina, gout, and dizziness. He repeatedly mentioned that his time was short. The nature of the arduous journey. Eisleben was Luther's birthplace and also where he died. His purpose for this trip was to mediate an inheritance dispute within the Counts of Mansfeld family. This journey was a huge challenge for a person in his 60s, afflicted with various illnesses at that time. He did not go to meddle because he was in good physical condition, but rather with a great sense of mission, persisting despite his physical discomfort. For Luther, this trip may not have been simply meddling. The Mansfeld family were the lords of his hometown and also among his protectors. Their internal divisions not only affected local stability but could also impact the advancement of the Reformation. Luther regarded mediating family disputes as an important pastoral responsibility, and he was willing to pay a huge physical price for it. In fact, he died only after successfully mediating. This, to some extent, also aligns with his image as a reformer. Therefore, his ability to complete this journey speaks more to his tenacious willpower and his commitment to the cause of faith. This journey likely exacerbated his already poor health, ultimately leading to his death. Look, how much like a standard plot in a film or TV series.
Focusing on his mental illness was enough.
Severe clinical depression, commonly known as Shenjingbing mental illness in Chinese folk terms, was a generally recognized condition of Luther's. From the Catholic perspective, this alone would have been sufficient to effectively discredit his personality and doctrines, without the need to fabricate additional rumors about his cause of death. Furthermore, the most advantageous cause of death for the Catholic Church would have been for him to be murdered by Catholic extremists. In that era, mental illness, whether understood as madness, demonic possession, or simply nervous disorder, was largely regarded as a moral defect, a manifestation of sin, or even evidence of being cursed or in league with the devil. Therefore, Luther suffering from severe mental illness would indeed have been devastating to his credibility, the origin of his theological ideas, and his personal holiness. Attackers could claim that the doctrines put forth by a mentally unstable person were unreliable and might even stem from personal delusions or demonic temptation. This could be even more damaging than accusing him of self-murder. Self-murder was often seen as a desperate sin, while mental illness could be directly linked to insanity or being controlled by evil spirits. In the social concepts of the time, mental illness was often accompanied by shame and ostracism. Publicizing Luther's mental illness would certainly have been extremely effective in weakening his image as a saint or prophet in the eyes of believers. Luther's mental illness was not widely known, although he himself repeatedly mentioned his struggle with despair in his letters, which is now widely considered a manifestation of depression. The Catholic side did not use this as a core weapon for large-scale, systematic defamation. Despite prevalent negative views, the understanding of mental illness at the time was not as clear and standardized as it is now. Luther's despair was more often interpreted by his followers as a spiritual struggle rather than a purely pathological condition. The Catholic side may have preferred to directly accuse him of heresy rather than delve into his psychological state. For the Catholic Church, the label heretic was the highest accusation in itself, sufficient to condemn and eliminate him. Accusing his ideas of stemming from mental illness might have seemed less direct or sacred than directly categorizing him as in league with the devil or deviating from the truth. Although mental illness has long-term effects, self-murder in the context of the time was a more explosive and final crime because it directly challenged the doctrine of reverence for life and God's sovereignty over life and death, making it easier to condemn. For the papacy, the most advantageous cause of Luther's death would have been assassination by Catholic extremists. If that were the case, the Catholic hierarchy could have shifted responsibility to a few radicals, thereby maintaining its image as a maintainer of peace and order. The papacy could condemn such an act and avoid having its own hands stained with blood. If Luther had died of illness, Protestants would have viewed it as God taking back his servant and might have deified him as an example of burning one's life for faith. However, if he died by self-murder or other disgraceful reasons, this martyr's halo could be effectively avoided. However, the Catholic Church did not take measures but allowed the self-murder rumors to circulate. The reasons could be as follows. In the 16th century, information spread very slowly and was difficult to control. When news of Luther's death spread, the initial reaction might have been chaotic, with various unverified rumors circulating. The Catholic Church likely did not have time to organize a unified and sophisticated PR strategy to concoct a perfect narrative of assassination by extremists. Although strategically, Luther's death by assassination would have been advantageous, the Catholic Church's animosity towards Luther at the time was deeply rooted. The papacy viewed Luther as a heretic and the instigator of church division. Emotionally and faithfully, the papacy should have been more inclined to see him end his life in a disgraceful manner as God's punishment for heresy. This emotional drive might have overshadowed a more rational political strategy. Compared to the martyr's halo that assassination might bring, the accusation of self-murder was, in Christian ethics, the most direct and undeniable sin, with almost no room for reversal. It could immediately place Luther at the lowest moral point of no return, without complex explanations. As for the hypothesis of assassination by Catholic extremists, while it might seem most advantageous from today's political PR perspective, at the time, the limitations of complex information dissemination would have made the Catholic Church more inclined to spread rumors that could directly plunge their opponent into a moral abyss, rather than constructing a complex narrative that required disclaiming responsibility.
The rapid decomposition of Martin Luther's body.
In Christian tradition, the incorruptibility of a saint's body, remaining uncorrupted for 100 years, is indeed a highly symbolic phenomenon, often regarded as a sign of sanctity and divine favor. However, Luther's body decomposed rapidly. This fact alone seems to have been strong enough evidence for the Catholic side to discredit Luther and confirm his heretical status, without needing to fabricate self-murder rumors. From a historical and religious symbolic perspective, the rapid decomposition of Luther's body could have been fully exploited by the Catholic Church to make a significant point. In Christian belief, an incorruptible body or holy body remaining uncorrupted is seen as a powerful sign that a saint has received God's grace and their soul has ascended to heaven. Conversely, if the body of someone considered a heretic rapidly decays, this could be interpreted as God's curse upon their sins, a clear sign of their failure to achieve salvation. This phenomenon could have been used to prove that Luther's doctrines were false and his path deviated from God's will. The Catholic Church could have propagated that even his physical body proved he was not a saint but a cursed individual. For Protestants, the appearance of such an anti-miracle would have shaken their faith and demoralized the Reform movement. Indeed, this seems like a more elegant, more sacred, and less easily refutable method of defamation than the self-murder rumor. After all, the rate of corpse decomposition is visible to the naked eye, unlike self-murder, which requires complex insider information. However, despite this immense potential, historical records suggest that the Catholic Church did not widely publicize Luther's rapid corpse decomposition as a primary point of attack, at least not as frequently as the self-murder rumor. There could be several reasons for this. One of the basic requirements for the Catholic Church to identify a saint is the incorruptibility of the holy body for 100 years. This is because, under normal circumstances, bodies decompose. So-called incorruptibility often implies divine intervention. Therefore, the rapid decomposition of Luther's body indicates that, at the very least, Luther was not a saint favored by heaven. The main point of attack by the Catholic Church against Luther was always his heretical doctrines, believing that Luther betrayed the Church and divided the Christian world. Therefore, accusing him of self-murder could link his despair to the doctrines he preached, implying that his heresy ultimately led to his personal destruction. This theological connection seemed faster and more direct than corpse decomposition. In Christian belief, self-murder is a grave sin because it deprives God-given life and the opportunity for repentance. In contrast, while corpse decomposition carries negative symbolism, it may not be as direct and strong in moral condemnation as self-murder. Rapid corpse decomposition, as a means of attack, is highly reasonable, unassailable, and symbolically powerful. There was much to be made of it.
The destructive power of the self-murder theory.
The core significance of the self-murder theory lies in its strategic value in religious conflict. Defining Luther's death as self-murder, its deepest and most damaging meaning is that it could directly equate Luther with Judas, who betrayed Jesus. In Christian tradition, Judas is the ultimate traitor. He not only betrayed Jesus but ultimately ended his own life by self-murder. His self-murder is seen as the ultimate expression of despair and failure to achieve salvation. If Luther also ended his life by self-murder, then regarding his actions in opposing papal authority and initiating the Reformation, the Catholic Church could extensively propagate. Luther, like Judas, was a betrayer who ultimately fell into despair due to his sins and had to self-destruct. This was not just physical death but also spiritual damnation. This connection between Luther and Judas had the power of a nuclear explosion. For Catholics, this was an extremely satisfying and faith-reinforcing narrative. It confirmed their belief that Luther was an evil heretic who ultimately received his deserved curse. This divine judgment type of ending could greatly enhance Catholics' loyalty to their doctrine and their disdain for the Reformers. For Protestants, it could confuse and demoralize them. If their spiritual leader died in such a disgraceful manner, it would certainly make them question the holiness and legitimacy of Luther's doctrines. It sowed seeds of doubt, greatly weakening the cohesion of the Reform movement. The adage "repeat a lie 1,000 times and it becomes the truth" aptly describes the mechanism of spreading such rumors. In an era of limited information and generally low education levels, whether true or false, repetition, sensationalism, and emotional resonance were powerful means of spreading information. For most ordinary people, there was no ability to verify the truth of rumors. Their access to information was limited, often relying only on the preaching of clergy or local authorities, as well as word of mouth from friends and family. When a rumor aligns with people's existing prejudices and satisfies their emotional needs, people are more willing to believe it, even without evidence. Once a rumor circulates, even centuries later, it may continue to exist in certain communities, becoming a form of oral history or folklore, difficult to eradicate. Therefore, even without conclusive evidence, or even with refuting evidence, some Catholic believers were happy to believe and actively spread the self-murder theory about Luther because the psychological and strategic benefits were immense. This once again confirms that in religious and ideological wars, the power of public opinion often transcends facts themselves.
Martin Luther doesn't need to die again.
As the saying goes, history is written by the victors. In an era where the universal Christian ecumenical movement is both vigorous and substantial, becoming politically correct, the vast majority of Christians probably do not want to believe in the theory of Martin Luther's natural death. However, whether he committed self-murder or not is no longer important. What is important is the undisputed rapid decomposition of the corpse, which at least proves that Martin Luther was not the saint glorified by the Protestant deification movement. The key is that if Martin Luther loses his saintly halo, the legitimacy of the Reformation movement will be shaken. In fact, Martin Luther's last trip to his hometown was, in itself, an act of self-murder. This is because he had long been talking about his old age, failing health, and having little time left. To prove his natural death, Martin Luther doesn't need to come back to life and die again to provide a live broadcast to the world. In fact, his rapid corpse decomposition and the fact that his bones are now completely gone has already written an imperishable testimony.